Space is no longer empty distance above the battlefield. It is the battlefield. And the first spacecraft, built to take down another spacecraft, showed how simple such a war could be. The first target in a major war today may be far above the battlefield. A satellite, hundreds or thousands of miles overhead, might be keeping time, guiding weapons, relaying orders, watching for missile launches, and feeding targeting data to forces on the ground. Modern militaries depend on signals from orbit, but they are not alone. Financial networks, telecom systems, and power grids depend on them too. The Soviet IS system was built to destroy satellites like these. It did not need lasers, astronauts, or an orbital dogfight. It just needed to explode near its targets and let its fragments do the rest. And the main reason it came to life was already flying much lower than any satellite. On May 1st, 1960, an American U-2 was deep over the Soviet Union. It carried cameras to photograph places Moscow wanted kept hidden, such as missile sites, air bases, test ranges, and military factories. And it did it almost without interference. At least, that was the American assumption. The U-2 was built to operate above 70,000 feet, high enough that altitude itself became part of its defense. That morning, near Sverdlovsk, Soviet air defenses fired a surface-to-air missile at the aircraft flown by American pilot Francis Gary Powers. The missile hit close enough to tear the U-2 apart. Powers ejected and came down alive, landing inside the Soviet Union, along with the wreckage of his aircraft. The Soviets didn't just bring the flight down. They recovered the aircraft, secured the evidence, and had everything they needed to embarrass Washington. The shootdown had become a public Cold War victory. Washington initially claimed the aircraft had been on a weather mission, but the cameras, equipment, and captured pilot made the mission impossible to deny. As a result, President Eisenhower stopped U-2 overflights of Soviet airspace. The aircraft had become too exposed. The need for intelligence was still there. Washington still needed to know where Soviet missiles were built, where they were tested, and how quickly the nuclear balance was moving. If aircraft could no longer cross the border, the next answer had to pass over it from space. The answer was satellites. And so, the U-2 crisis gave new urgency to Corona, a CIA Air Force satellite program that was already underway. After a long run of failed early missions, Corona became America's first successful camera that could cross Soviet territory without a pilot. At its core, it was an unmanned spy satellite built to take pictures on film. The whole thing looked like a slim metal cylinder, stuffed with optics, film reels, and altitude control gear. Corona could not send high-resolution images digitally. Instead, when the satellite finished taking photographs, it sealed the exposed film inside a re-entry capsule, often called a film bucket. The capsule then separated from the satellite, re-entered the atmosphere behind a heat shield, opened a parachute, and was caught in midair by a specially equipped recovery aircraft over the Pacific. On one early success, a capsule was caught by a C-119 aircraft at about 8,000 feet, roughly 360 miles southwest of Honolulu. With this deployed, no pilot crossed the border, no aircraft had to escape air defenses, and no wrecked reconnaissance aircraft had to land on Soviet soil. For Moscow, this was worse than the U-2. The overflight problem had moved beyond the reach of normal air defenses. Moscow tried to challenge the satellite problem through diplomacy. Soviet officials argued that if an American machine passed over Soviet territory to collect military intelligence, then it was still violating Soviet security, even if it was above the atmosphere. Yet Sputnik had already passed over other nations in 1957, and no one treated it as an aircraft violating airspace. So when Moscow pushed the issue, it found little support. Other governments were not eager to define a national border that stretched endlessly upward into space, and there was no agreed-upon altitude at which sovereignty ended. That put the Soviets in a bind. Diplomacy wasn't solving the problem, so the answer moved to engineering. If Moscow couldn't get the Watcher banned, it had to find a way to reach it. and that meant building a weapon for orbit. The answer came from Vladimir Chalome, one of the Soviet Union's most ambitious rocket designers. He ran OKB-52, a design bureau competing for influence with Sergei Korolev's more famous space program. In April 1960, shortly before the U-2 crisis became public, Khrushchev held a defense meeting at his Crimean summer residence. Chalome saw rockets as military tools and pitched an entire system around this idea. His key proposal was the UR-200, a rocket he wanted to use both as an intercontinental ballistic missile and as a military space launcher. It was meant to carry different strategic payloads into service or into orbit. One of those payloads was the IS, short for Istrebitel Sputnikov, satellite destroyer. The IS was meant to be a spacecraft capable of attacking other spacecraft. Instead of requiring a pilot, it used ground control and onboard systems to close the distance. Inside, it carried explosives, and once it reached the enemy satellite, it detonated nearby. This would throw fragments across the target's path at orbital speed. In plain terms, it was a kamikaze spacecraft. The United States was reaching a similar conclusion from the other side. To American planners, Soviet satellites would not remain scientific symbols for long. They could watch forces, support nuclear operations, or become part of command systems. Washington did not want that advantage to go unanswered. In 1959, the American Bold Orion air-launched ballistic missile was fired from a B-47 bomber in a test against the Explorer 6 satellite. It passed within about 4 miles of the target, which was close enough to suggest a nuclear warhead might have worked, but not close enough for a conventional explosion, which would have required far more precision. But Chalome's proposal was more dangerous than a missile fired upward at a passing satellite. A missile had one chance to meet a target racing around Earth at orbital speed. IS, meanwhile, entered orbit with the target, adjusted its path, and closed the distance over time. That was the kind of answer Khrushchev was willing to back. In March 1961, the Soviet government formally approved the development of the anti-satellite complex. However, Chalome's plan outpaced his hardware. The UR-200 was still in development by 1963. Even 2 years after approval, the intended launcher still had not proved it could carry the satellite destroyer. That meant Chalome could either wait for his own rocket and risk losing momentum, or put the first IS prototypes on someone else's launcher. And so, to get the IS vehicle into orbit, he turned to Korolev's R-7, the rival rocket line associated with the Soviet Union's most famous space victories, Sputnik in 1957 and Vostok in 1961. The first IS test vehicles flew under the public name Polet, meaning flight. On November 1st, 1963, Polet-1 launched on an R-7 rocket. The spacecraft used for the test weighed nearly 2 tons. It was built around a cylindrical instrument section, with an engine package and 4 round propellant tanks clustered behind it. Once it reached orbit, Polet-1 began changing its path. It fired its engines more than once and shifted its orbit. Then Polet-1 changed the inclination of its orbital plane, tilting the entire path it followed around the Earth. Changing inclination is one of the most fuel-hungry moves a spacecraft can make, because it changes the angle of the entire orbit. It was a breakthrough for the program. Polet-2 followed on April 12, 1964, to confirm that Polet-1 was not a one-time trick. Just as the flight tests were beginning to prove the concept, Chalome lost the political patron who had protected his projects. In October 1964, Khrushchev was forced out by the Soviet leadership. Chalome's UR-200 became the first major casualty. The new leadership moved away from his rocket and favored the R-36 missile, developed under Mikhail Yangel, which was already further along in development as a heavy strategic missile. On August 24, 1965, the Soviet government assigned Yangel's OKB-586 to develop an IS launcher based on the R-36 missile family. This reportedly saved almost 2 years of development, compared with building a new launcher path from scratch. With it on hand, the Soviets could finally begin practicing what an attack would look like by 1967. That year, an early IS engineering test, Cosmos 185, was launched to confirm two things: that the new rocket could place an IS-type vehicle into orbit, and that the spacecraft could still maneuver once it reached orbit. Like the earlier Paulette vehicles, Cosmos 185 successfully changed its orbit after launch. On October 19, 1968, the Soviets conducted a target interceptor test by launching Cosmos 248, which served as the target in orbit. It was a large spacecraft, weighing roughly 10,000 pounds, orbiting at about 342 by 304 miles. Its job was to record mist distance, fragment patterns, and the effects of the explosion. Instead of maneuvering, it remained on a known, predictable path. The next day, Cosmos 249 launched as the interceptor. It weighed roughly 3,100 pounds, was about 14 feet long, 6 feet wide, and first entered on a low orbit at about 158 by 85 miles. Then it began maneuvering until it climbed into a much higher orbit, around 1,353 by 319 miles, setting up the geometry for a pass near Cosmos 248. About 3.5 hours after launch, roughly 2 orbits later, Cosmos 249 came back down from its high path and passed near Cosmos 248. Both spacecraft were orbiting Earth at roughly 17,000 miles per hour, or about 5 miles per second. Then the interceptor detonated. It carried a fragmentation warhead, with some later descriptions putting the explosive charge at about 660 pounds. The blast produced up to 109 detectable fragments. Even so, it was not a clean intercept. The explosion happened outside the reported 1-kilometer lethal radius, leaving Cosmos 248 undestroyed. This meant the idea worked. The only problem left to solve was distance. The Soviets targeted Cosmos 248 again on November 1, 1968. The interceptor was Cosmos 252, which entered a low starting orbit of about 155 by 87 miles above Earth. From there, it began changing its orbit to close the gap. The new orbit ran from roughly 334 miles at the low end to about 1,350 miles at the high end. From there, the interceptor could swing high, fall back down through the lower part of its orbit, and meet Cosmos 248 at the right point in its path. Cosmos 252 reached the target area the same day it launched. Unlike its predecessor, it got close enough. It exploded within the reported 1-kilometer lethal radius of Cosmos 248, generating up to 139 detectable fragments. The target was no longer protected by altitude. The border had moved upward, and the weapon had followed it. And still, Washington did not stop sending satellites. The IS tests gave American analysts a new threat to track, not a reason to give up the eyes that had moved into orbit. For Washington, the calculation was simple. Satellites were a risk, but going blind was worse. After Cosmos 252, Soviet engineers needed to know how close the interceptor had come, how the fragments had spread, how many fragments had struck the target, and whether the target would continue to function after the pass. For a real interception, the Soviets needed more than just the weapon. They also needed the ground network behind it. Teams led by Anatoly Savin helped build that system, first through KB-1 and later TSNII Kometa, giving operators the ability to find the target, track the interceptor, send commands, and bring the two closer together. By 1969, satellite tracking stations at sites such as Balkhash and Irkutsk gave the system more eyes on orbit. The interceptor could only go after a target if the ground system had already tracked it, so the attack really began before launch, with stations measuring and predicting the target's path. The Soviets also had to improve the targets. In 1971, the Soviets introduced the DSP-1M target satellites. These were measuring devices placed in orbit specifically to be attacked. Each weighed about 1,400 pounds and carried equipment to record what happened when fragments struck the spacecraft. They carried telemetry systems, orbit sensors, protective armor, and the SFO shrapnel sensor package that registered how many fragments struck the target and sent that data back before the satellite failed. The sensors were built to record impacts at relative speeds of about 2,700 to 4,700 miles per hour. At those speeds, even small pieces of metal could hit like ammunition. The targets were designed to keep transmitting after as many as 3 intercept attempts, giving engineers a way to compare one pass with the next. With these systems in place, the Soviets carried out 23 launches and 7 interceptions. That data helped turn the system from a crude satellite bomb into a repeatable weapon, ready to prove itself against a real American satellite. Publicly, the Cold War was entering a period of détente. Washington and Moscow were signing agreements to try and reduce the chance of nuclear war. One of these was the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which forced IS flight testing to pause for several years. Officially, the treaty dealt with missile defense systems, not reconnaissance satellites. In practice, though, it put a pause on Soviet anti-satellite testing, while American satellites kept crossing over Soviet missile sites, naval bases, launch facilities, and military plants. Even so, in February 1973, the first version of the IS system was declared operational. That did not mean Moscow could wipe every American satellite from orbit overnight, but it did mean the Soviet military now had a working system designed to attack them. At least in theory, given that tests would finally be allowed to resume in 1976, citing the American space shuttle as the official reason why. The space shuttle was a reusable spacecraft more than 120 feet long, with a payload bay about 60 feet long. Soviet planners feared it might approach Soviet satellites, look them over, seize them, damage them, or help with military work in orbit. Not all of those fears were fully supported by evidence, but they were enough to keep the pressure building. The satellite destroyer now had fresh justification. To address the threat, the IS system was upgraded to reach targets at roughly twice its earlier reported altitude. To achieve this, Soviet engineers did not simply replace the old weapon with a more powerful explosive charge. Instead, they strengthened the whole attack chain. Improved tracking gave ground stations a clearer picture of the target's path. Improved guidance helped the interceptor correct its course sooner. A refined launch profile put the Hunter closer to the geometry it needed. This also reduced the time required for an attack. Earlier intercepts could take 1 or 2 orbits to set up, about 90 to 200 minutes. The upgraded system pushed toward a first orbit attack. By late 1978, the upgraded IS system had been accepted into Soviet armaments. After July 1979, it was considered operationally ready and had become a standing weapon for a war that might begin above the atmosphere. When President Ronald Reagan announced his Strategic Defense Initiative in 1983, Yuri Andropov, former head of the KGB, announced a Soviet moratorium and public offer on anti-satellite weapons. This move allowed the Soviet Union to present itself as the side seeking to stop the arms race from escalating. This frustrated parts of the Soviet military. To the officers who had built and defended the program, the moratorium did not make American satellites less threatening. It looked like the same pattern they had already seen after the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. American satellites kept flying, while Soviet tests stopped. In May 1987, Mikhail Gorbachev went to Baikonur, the Soviet Union's main space launch center in Kazakhstan, to help determine the program's fate. He was trying to put the Soviet Union out of the arms race, while the officers around him sought to keep weapons they believed still mattered. General Anatoly Zavalishyn showed him the IS spacecraft and the newer Naryad platform, a system intended for anti-satellite and anti-missile missions. Zavalishyn argued for renewed testing. He argued that the Soviet Union still needed these weapons, and even suggested that the launches could be hidden under a cover story, so outsiders would not understand what they were seeing. Gorbachev refused. At that moment, another test risked becoming a political liability, just as he was trying to cut military spending, improve relations with the West, and pull the Soviet Union out of the weapons race that was draining it. A disguised anti-satellite test would have sent the opposite message. A few days later, Baikonur still launched a military spacecraft into orbit. Energia, the most powerful Soviet rocket ever flown, launched an experimental military platform reportedly capable of supporting anti-satellite weapons, better known as Polyus. It was about 120 feet long, about 13 feet wide, and weighed roughly 80 tons. For scale, it was longer than the Boeing 737 fuselage and far heavier than most operational satellites of the era. After separation, Polyus tried to turn itself into the right position for orbital insertion. A guidance error caused it to perform the maneuver incorrectly. Instead of reaching orbit, it fell back into the atmosphere and came down over the Pacific. Even if Polyus belonged to a different branch of Soviet space weapons development, it was a continuation of Tolome's ideas. After Gorbachev, that line of work did not continue in the open the way the generals wanted. The old IS system was frozen by politics, arms control pressure, and then by the collapse of the Soviet Union. The IS system never stopped US reconnaissance, but it proved that a spacecraft could go after another spacecraft. Back then, the main fear fueling this was spy satellites. Today, the scale is completely different. As of May 2026, more than 15,600 active satellites were in orbit, along with over 33,000 catalogued objects overall. The global positioning system alone depends on satellites flying about 12,550 miles above Earth, circling the planet twice a day, and broadcasting timing signals used for far more than navigation. The satellite is now part of the nervous system of a modern country. That is why governments now treat space as a military domain. The United States created the Space Force in 2019. Russia maintains space forces within its Aerospace Force. China's 2024 reorganization of its military also placed greater emphasis on aerospace and space operations, replacing the old Strategic Support Force structure with new arms, including an Aerospace Force. European governments have also begun treating satellites and their ground infrastructure as strategic assets that must be protected. That does not mean war in space is inevitable, but it means governments no longer treat space as empty. The first satellite destroyer showed why. Once a machine in orbit becomes important enough to depend on, it becomes important enough to target.